Solar's had a very specific and very positive reputation, which is that year after year it simply got cheaper, with panels improving, batteries improving, manufacturing scaling, and for most people, the numbers on their quotes gradually coming down. So it's completely understandable that when we now hear solar and battery prices are likely to rise somewhere in the region of 9 to 11%, it feels a little unexpected and even a little uncomfortable. With some assuming it must be a short-term blip, and I guess others assuming suppliers are just pushing prices up again. When, in reality, what we're seeing isn't solar suddenly becoming expensive, but solar becoming priced normally. And to understand why that matters, we really need to go back to the beginning. Not to the installers or to the warehouses, but into the ground itself. When most people picture a solar panel, they imagine something modern and refined with glass, aluminium frames and factories full of machinery. And while that part is absolutely true, before any of that exists, a solar panel is really just a collection of raw materials taken from the Earth's crust. At the heart of almost every single solar panel is silicon, which comes from quartz, one of the most common minerals in the Earth's crust. But only a very small proportion of that quartz is actually suitable for turning into solar-grade silicon. And getting it to the level of purity required for photovoltaics involves extremely energy-intensive processes with very high temperatures, huge industrial furnaces, and a constant, reliable electricity supply, which means silicon production is capitally heavy, slow to scale, and not something you can simply ramp up overnight if demand increases. Because simply building new refineries takes years to design, build, and bring online, creating a natural bottleneck long before a panel even reaches a roof. But silicon, interestingly, isn't where the biggest pressure is coming from right now, because that distinction belongs to silver, which surprises a lot of people. Every solar panel contains silver, not in large quantities, but in just enough that without it the panel wouldn't function properly. Silver is used to form ultra-fine conductive pathways that collect electricity from the solar cell and move it to the rest of the system. These pathways need to be extremely conductive and extremely reliable and able to survive decades of heat, cold, and moisture. Ultraviolet light is also a big factor in why silver is used. Silver remains one of the uniquely well-suited elements to the job, which is why we have this issue with pricing right now. The key issue with silver, and this is the important thing to understand, is that silver is almost never mined for solar itself, with around 3/4 of the world's silver supply coming as a byproduct of mining other materials like copper, zinc, lead, and even gold. That means silver production doesn't respond directly to silver demand at all, but instead depends on the economics of completely different industries. So even if silver prices rise sharply, miners don't suddenly produce more silver unless it makes sense to mine more copper or zinc, for example. Over the last few years, solar has quietly become one of the largest industrial consumers of silver in the world. And while manufacturers have worked incredibly hard to reduce the amount of silver that goes into each and every panel, and to their credit, they've done a pretty good job of that, global solar deployment has grown even faster than anyone predicted. That means that despite using less silver per panel, the total amount of silver consumed by the solar industry continues to rise year after year. When you combine this with rising demand from electrical vehicles, grid infrastructure, and electronics, you end up with a situation where the world is now using more silver each year than it produces. That doesn't always lead to immediate price spikes though, but it does create a market with no slack at all, so when the pressure builds up, prices tend to jump rather than drift. In many commodity markets, higher prices naturally encourage more supply. But silver simply doesn't behave like that because as a byproduct, metal miners don't increase output unless it makes sense for the primary metals they are targeting. Opening or expanding mines takes years of planning, environmental approvals, financing, and construction. So when demand increases, supply just simply doesn't catch up and prices adjust instead. For solar manufacturers operating on already very thin margins, sustained silver prices don't just reduce profits, they redefine the minimum cost of producing a solar panel in general. And that cost doesn't disappear, it just moves through the system. At this point, it's impossible not to talk about China, because China dominates global manufacturing of solar panels and battery cells. For many years, Chinese exporters benefited from VAT export rebates that helped soften costs and keep global prices extremely low. Not by eliminating costs, but by cushioning them. That policy is now changing, with export VAT rebates for solar products being removed from April 2026, and battery export rebates being reduced through 2026 and removed entirely in 2027. This doesn't mean shortages, but it does change the economics, because manufacturers have far fewer tools to absorb rising material and energy costs. And after years of intense price competition, there simply isn't much margin left. So prices adjust slowly and structurally rather than suddenly and temporarily. Batteries are going through a very similar transition, because while battery prices fell rapidly as factories scaled and competition intensified, batteries are deeply tied to raw materials like lithium, copper, and aluminium. When changes to battery export rebates were announced, manufacturers rushed to produce and ship early, increasing demand for lithium and pushing prices up almost immediately. This tells us one thing: the battery market is moving out of a price war phase and into a more mature phase where real material costs matter again. This means prices may still fluctuate, but the long downward trend is no longer guaranteed. So when we put all this together, silver prices, mining constraints, energy-intensive refining, export policy changes, battery material volatility, freight costs, and currency pressures, each on their own might be manageable, but you can see why together they create a structural reset rather than a short-term price blip. Now, this is especially when manufacturers and suppliers have already been absorbing rising costs for years, and there simply isn't much flexibility left in the system. This is why, instead of seeing sudden shocks, we're seeing a gradual adjustment that typically lands in the 9 to 11% range. Not as a panic price adjustment, but just as the reality of solar costs catching up. It's also worth saying very clearly that solar and battery storage prices have fallen drastically over the last 5 years, to the point where the industry has been operating on extremely tight margins for quite some time. And while prices have been predicted to rise eventually, the combination of a silver shortage and Chinese export rebates being removed means we could see a more notable shift in cost than people have become used to. That doesn't mean solar is suddenly a bad investment. Far from it, because solar remains a very strong long-term proposition, even if we're moving from a period where it was extremely good value to good value. Our advice is this: if you have an outstanding quotation with us, or if you're actively looking at solar, or even just interested in the technology and trying to understand how it all works, now is genuinely a very good time to start the conversation. There's still plenty of time between now and April, and prices are still likely to hold in the short term as suppliers rush to secure and hold stock, creating a temporary price buffer. But that stock will eventually run out, and when it does, the higher supply prices will kick in and start to feed through. 2 of our suppliers are already indicating potential increases anywhere from 9 to 25% across certain solar component ranges. Not across everything, and not all at once, but enough to really matter when it comes to your investment. If avoiding those increases is important to you, our advice is simply to get in touch sooner rather than later. Not because prices are jumping tomorrow or there's a countdown clock ticking, but because the market is clearly in a price transition, and once lower cost stock is gone, it just will not come back. Solar itself remains a fantastic technology and a strong long-term decision, even if timing right now matters just a little bit more than it used to. If you found this video useful, or any of our others, please subscribe and like it. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.